How many women went to the tomb? One of the most popular alleged contradictions is to point out each gospel says a different number of women went to the tomb on Sunday morning. Matthew says Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. Mark says Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. Luke says it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and additional women. And John only mentions Mary Magdalene. So all agree Mary Magdalene was there, but Matthew adds another Mary. Mark and Luke say this was Mary the mother of James, and Mark adds someone else named Salome, and Luke adds Joanna. So skeptics assert the Gospels are inconsistent and cannot give us a clear picture of who was at the tomb on Sunday morning. However, in reality, skeptics are overplaying their hand. The issue can be sorted out by noting the ancient literary practice of spotlighting. First, it should be obvious, no gospel says only the women I have listed went to the tomb. Since they do not say this, the gospels do not necessarily contradict. Second, take the Gospel of John. It is true he says Mary went to the tomb, but in the very next verse, he reports that Mary said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." It is unlikely she is referring to herself as a royal plural, and more likely implies there were other women with her. So in reality, both John and Luke are open to there being additional women with Mary. The reason as to why John doesn't mention them has to do with the ancient literary practice called spotlighting. The scholar Mike Licona defines spotlighting as when an author focuses attention on a person so that the person's involvement in a scene is clearly described, whereas mention of others who were likewise involved is neglected. The author has shined his literary spotlight on that person. Think of a theatrical performance. During an act in which several are simultaneously on the stage, the lights go out and a spotlight shines on a particular actor. Others are present but are unseen. In literary spotlighting, the author only mentions one of the people present, but knows of the others. Licona highlights how spotlighting occurs in other ancient works. Specifically, he goes through the lives of Plutarch and compares how Plutarch alone writes each separate biography. Given that Plutarch is the only author of these biographies, we can see how he alone reports the same event in separate accounts. And quite often, Plutarch utilizes spotlighting when he talks about an event in one biography as compared to another. For example, in the life of Cicero, Crassus, Marcellus, and Metellus visit Cicero at night regarding an urgent matter. However, in life of Crassus, Plutarch doesn't mention the other two and spotlights Crassus as the one who goes to Cicero. Later in the life of Crassus, Marcellinus and Domitius ask Pompey and Crassus if they intend to run for consulship. But in life of Pompey, only Marcellinus is mentioned. In the life of Antony, Octavian, Hirtius, and Pansa were sent by the Senate to drive Antony out of Italy. But in life of Brutus, Octavius is spotlighted as the only one. Likewise in the Gospels, they were capable and allowed to employ the device of spotlighting. In John 19:25, he mentions the women standing at the cross, but he does not mention the disciple that Jesus loved as being there as well, even though in the next verse he references him. Luke employs spotlighting by only mentioning Peter running to the tomb, even though John says it was Peter and the beloved disciple. However, later in Luke, on the road to Emmaus, the other disciples say, "Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said," implying Luke is aware that Peter was not alone when he ran to the tomb. Therefore, when John only mentions Mary going to the tomb, he is probably just spotlighting her. Likewise, Matthew and Mark are probably doing the same thing, spotlighting only some of the women who went. This is not too different than the idea that I could tell you about my trip to Pittsburgh to visit family and omit that my wife and daughter went with me. But if my wife told the same story and mentioned that all three of us went, would our stories contradict? Of course not. We would recognize this as spotlighting. There is no rule that the gospel authors had to mention literally every person involved in every incident that happened with Jesus. Matthew is probably just mentioning the two. He's spotlighting. There is no rule that the gospel authors had to mention literally every person involved in every incident that happened with Jesus. Matthew is probably just mentioning the two. He felt necessary to get the story across. Mark is probably doing the same. And John probably didn't feel it was necessary to write beyond Mary Magdalene's experience. So considering the ancient literary device of spotlighting, there is no contradiction here. No gospel says, let alone implies, only the women they mention were the ones who went to the tomb. And there is no rule stating they have to mention every woman involved. Also, Richard Bauckham suggests each gospel author only mention the specific women they did because they were careful to name only the women that were known to each author as a witness. If Mark was unaware of Joanna, but Luke was aware of her from another source, Luke could feel safe mentioning her because he had independent verification from another source that was unavailable to Mark. If Matthew was aware of the Gospel of Mark, but could not verify Salome, was present there within his own community, he may have simply taken the safe road and omitted her. This implies the Gospel authors may have been careful to include references to people they could only verify from witnesses or authoritative members of the church, instead of being careless in how they recorded things. Bauckham says, it is natural to suppose that these women were well known not just for having once told their stories, but as people who remained accessible and authoritative sources of these traditions as long as they lived. Which women were well known to each evangelist may have depended on the circles in which that evangelist collected traditions and the circles in which each woman moved during her lifetime. The differences among the gospel narratives of the women's visit to the tomb may well reflect rather directly the different ways in which the story was told by the different women. The omission of Salome by both Matthew and Luke shows that the evangelists did not retain the names of women who had become obscure. Those named by each evangelist were, like their stories, still fresh in the memories of that evangelist's informants, if not the evangelist's own memory. Thus, there is no reason to suppose the Gospels contradict when they report the women as they do. They are more than likely employing the literary device of spotlighting and only mentioning those they felt they needed to get the story across. Or employing this device because they were careful to only mention witnesses they could verify within their communities. Thus, this supposed contradiction can be resolved. How many angels or men were at the tomb? Skeptics will note there are inconsistencies with what happened on Sunday morning when Jesus rose from the dead. Specifically, with regards to who was at the tomb to announce that Jesus had risen. Mark says it was a man, Matthew says it was an angel, Luke says there were 2 men, and John says there were 2 angels. Now, despite this appearing as an inconsistency on the surface, if we study the details more, we will find this hardly qualifies as a contradiction. First, the fact that Matthew and Mark only mention 1 being there instead of 2 doesn't mean there was a contradiction. In the ancient world, authors often employed a literary device called spotlighting. Mike Licona defines this as when an author focuses attention on a person so that the person's involvement in a scene is clearly described, whereas mention of others who were likewise involved is neglected. The author has shined his literary spotlight on that person. He then goes on to cover several examples of spotlighting happening throughout the lives of Plutarch. For example, in the life of Julius Caesar, Plutarch mentions that many of the conspirators were wounded in the process of assassinating Julius Caesar. But in the life of Brutus, Plutarch spotlights Brutus's wounds without mentioning that many of the others were also wounded. In the life of Cato Minor, Plutarch says that Cato rescued Cicero and others from the younger Pompey. But in the life of Cicero, only Cicero is spotlighted as being saved. In the life of Brutus, Brutus orders a man named Hortensius to execute Gaius. But in the life of Antony, only Brutus is mentioned as executing Gaius. Likewise, in the life of Brutus, Plutarch says Antony retaliated by killing Hortensius. But in life of Antony, Antony orders Hortensius to be killed by someone else. So Matthew and Mark are probably just spotlighting the angel that spoke and didn't find it necessary in their ancient cultural context to mention there was another one with him. There is no rule that the gospel authors had to mention literally everyone involved in every incident they report. Matthew and Mark probably only felt it necessary to mention the angel that spoke to get the story across. With regards to two gospel authors saying they were men and the other two saying they were angels, this is hardly an issue. Luke, for example, does refer to them as men, but later in the very same chapter, he also says they were angels. Mark describes the man as in a white robe delivering divine revelation. Throughout the New Testament and in other Jewish works, angelic and divine beings are often described as being in white and appearing at random to deliver divine revelation. They can also be described as appearing as men. So it is hardly a problem to suggest Mark is claiming an angel spoke to the women who appeared as a man in a white robe. Both Matthew and John also describe the angels as being dressed in white. Skeptics also allege that Matthew contradicts the other Gospels in where one of the angels was sitting. The other three suggest the angels were inside the tomb, but Matthew 28:2 says one angel sat on a stone outside of the tomb. However, Matthew might also imply the angel moved and that time had passed from when the stone had rolled away to when the women arrived. He also says the angel stated, "Come, see the place where he lay," which implies the angels moved and one was speaking from inside the empty tomb. Another objection is Luke says the angels were standing, but John and Mark say they were sitting. But the Greek word can be translated to mean appear or to be present. It does not necessarily mean to stand. Skeptics will also note what the angel says to the women is different in each of the synoptics. But within the ancient cultural context, exact wording was not necessary, and authors were expected to paraphrase and summarize to help readers better understand what was happening. The 4th century scholar, Theon of Alexandria, explicitly notes these techniques were employed quite often and were well within the bounds of historiography. To quote, "All ancient writers seem to have used paraphrase in the best possible way, rephrasing not only their own writings, but those of each other." Mike Licona comments on his works and says, Theon discusses how there is a substantial amount of flexibility involved when reconstructing speeches, and the imagination of the writer is welcomed. However, the narration must be credible and suitable to the speakers, audience members, and occasion. Theon discusses other techniques by which one may vary a narrative, sometimes as making a straightforward statement, and sometimes as doing something more than making a factual statement, and sometimes in the form of questions, and sometimes as things we seek to learn about, and sometimes as things about which we are in doubt, and sometimes as making a command, sometimes expressing a wish, and sometimes swearing to something, sometimes addressing the participants, sometimes advancing suppositions, sometimes using dialogue. In other words, ancient writers could rephrase or paraphrase as they saw fit to best pass on the narration. Statements would be turned into questions. A monologue could be turned into a dialogue. Words that could be more appropriate to pass on the message could be substituted. Because passing on the message and making sure the audience understood what happened was more important than exact wording. For example, in Plutarch's work, Life of Julius Caesar, he records that a piece of graffiti said, "You are sleeping, O Brutus, and you are not Brutus." But in Life of Brutus, Plutarch says the graffiti read as, "Brutus, you are sleeping, and you are not really Brutus." And there were many other places where paraphrasing like this happens. Again, it was about getting the message across, not exact wording. So given the ancient cultural context, the gospel authors were well within reason to paraphrase and summarize what the angel had said to the women. Demanding exact wording is forcing our cultural context onto the ancient world. They were more concerned with passing on meaning, as that was more important in the long run. So once we move past the surface level reading of the Gospels, we can easily point out there is no real contradiction, and it is quite easy to harmonize these accounts, especially when we take into account the cultural context. Thus, this supposed contradiction can be resolved. When did Jesus appear before the women? The Gospel of Matthew says that on Sunday morning, the women discovered the empty tomb, and then were told by angels that Jesus rose from the dead, and so they ran back to tell the disciples. The text seems to indicate that on the way, Jesus appeared to them and told the women to tell the disciples to go to Galilee. However, in John's Gospel, the women discover the empty tomb and run back to tell the disciples. Then the text records that Peter, John, and Mary Magdalene went back to the tomb. Peter and John leave, and the angels speak with Mary, and then Jesus appears to her. Skeptics will note these two accounts do not chronologically line up and contradict each other in multiple ways. Some Christians respond by trying to harmonize the accounts in a way that preserves all the chronological aspects in both Gospels. Perhaps what happened is the women went to the tomb and found it empty. Mary Magdalene was so distraught, she ran ahead to the disciples, leaving the other women behind. Then the angels appeared to the other women that remained behind, and then they went to deliver the message to the disciples. On the way back, Jesus appeared to them. Meanwhile, Mary, John, and Peter ran to the tomb but took a different way, thereby missing the other women who were looking for the disciples. Then Peter and John left, and the angels and Jesus appeared to Mary alone. This is one possible way to harmonize the accounts, but it is complex and unnecessary. Michael Licona suggests a simpler explanation, namely that the Synoptic Gospels have compressed and conflated elements to make the narrative more understandable for their audience. As we noted in other videos in this series, ancient authors were not bound by modern rules of writing. Licona notes ancient authors utilized a number of liberties when writing ancient historical texts. He says, classical scholars have recognized a number of compositional devices that are practically universal in ancient historiography. Some of these devices are transferal, when an author knowingly attributes words or deeds to a person that actually belong to another person. The author has transferred the words or deeds. Displacement, when an author knowingly uproots an event from its original context and transplants it in another. The author has displaced the event. Displacement has some similarities with telescoping, which is the presentation of an event as having occurred either earlier or more recently than it actually occurred. Plutarch displaces events and even occasionally informs us he has done so. Conflation, when an author combines elements from two or more events or people and narrates them as one, the author has conflated them. Accordingly, some displacement and or transferal will always occur in the conflation of stories. Compression, when an author knowingly portrays events over a shorter period of time than the actual time it took for those events to occur, the author has compressed the story. Simplification, when an author adapts material by omitting or altering details that may complicate the overall narrative, the author has simplified the story. The point being, ancient authors utilized more liberties when writing down historical accounts. They could reorganize events, modify the chronological order, transfer the words of someone to another, and combine events into one. This does not mean, though, that an author was free to invent entire stories and pass them off as history. They still had to report historical events, but could do so with these compositional devices in mind. J.L. Moll says, if the historian exercises some restraint in the bending of the facts, the procedure is legitimate enough in itself, and perhaps even, to some degree, and in one form or another, inevitable if historiography is to contribute to any real understanding of human affairs. Admittedly, Plutarch puts a lower priority on the initial establishment of the facts than some ancient historians proper, though a higher priority than others. But on the other hand, his manipulation of the facts does not permit invention from nothing. He is therefore a liar, only if truth be held to consist solely in precise historical truth. In other words, ancient authors could rework events, simplify and compress stories, but authors like Plutarch were unlikely to invent entire episodes out of thin air. For example, Suetonius and Cassius Dio say that Julius Caesar reflected on the life of Alexander the Great when he was in front of a statue of him. But Plutarch says Caesar did this when reading about Alexander as he was approaching the ocean. Caesar probably did such a thing, but either Plutarch or Suetonius and Cassius Dio simply displaced the event to help with the narrative flow. Christopher Pelling also notes Plutarch likely dated this episode to a later time period to better suit his narrative flow, as it better fit at the time when Caesar's ambitions became central. Plutarch also displays quotes and events. In Life of Sertorius, Sertorius makes a sarcastic statement about Pompey and Metellus after a battle, but in Life of Pompey, he utters it after learning that Pompey arrived in Spain and before the battle. Instead of Sertorius making the statement twice, it is likely Plutarch displaced the event to help with his narrative flow. In Life of Pompey and Life of Caesar, the first agrarian law was proposed prior to Caesar giving his daughter in marriage to Pompey. But in Life of Cato Minor, the marriage preceded the introduction of the agrarian law. Craig Keener conducted a study by comparing the life and suicide of Otho in the works of Suetonius, Tacitus, and Plutarch, and notes there are several differences with regards to the order of events and how things play out in each account. For example, the sequence of information in our sources differs, sometimes in a manner that affects how we understand the events. Thus, did Otho order quick engagement before or after his initial victories? Since both writers consider his choice rash in retrospect, one might argue that Tacitus rearranged the events to reinforce this point, but given Tacitus's enormous detail in sequencing of the material, and the fact that Suetonius merely summarizes various points here, Tacitus surely preserves the original sequence. Keener also notes that Suetonius likely condensed the story in multiple places, because his elite readers would have already been familiar with the story. The three authors also contradict in multiple ways, and sometimes an author reports an event that the other two miss or only allude to. But this doesn't mean the account of Otho was fiction or constructed whole cloth. There most likely was a real Otho who was emperor for 3 months and committed suicide. Historians also do not suggest the accounts of Otho cannot be trusted because they contradict at times. Instead, they often work with the accounts, applying the principle of charity to reconstruct a chronology and infer when events only mentioned in one account most likely happen in the sequence. Mere contradictions between different accounts does not mean the story is fiction or unreliable. If that was the case, we would have to doubt Hannibal's crossing of the Alps, the assassination of Julius Caesar, and Nero's burning of Rome. In fact, in non-Western and ancient cultures, chronological sequence is not as important when passing on a story. Events are often out of order. What mattered to the ancient audience was the narrative flow, in that the events were structured in a coherent fashion. Richards and O'Brien say, in the non-Western world, stories often circulate around the event until it coalesces. Therefore, orderliness, but not the chronological sequence, is important. Unfortunately for us, the events in the Bible are not necessarily presented in historical, chronological order. A lot of skeptics and fundamentalists assume if the Gospels were not written in chronological order, they must be in error. But this is applying a standard from our cultural expectations. The ancient world cared far less about chronological order and cared more about sequencing events into a story that followed certain themes. Mark, for example, places the episode of Jesus cleansing the temple in the middle of the account of him cursing the fig tree. The likely reason is to make a comparison between the tree and the temple, as neither was bearing good fruit. Luke organizes based on references to the temple. So when Jesus is tempted by Satan, it makes sense to place that temptation last, instead of second, as in Matthew. Matthew, on the other hand, transports major events of Jesus' life to mountains. Since he is organizing around that theme, it makes sense for him to place the temptation on the mountain last. Chronological order was not important. What was important was the message and narrative flow. So when it comes to the different sequences in the Gospels, it is likely that either John or Matthew is displacing the appearance to the women to fit each Gospel's narrative flow. John is spotlighting Mary Magdalene and possibly decided to place the appearance to the women after John and Peter went to the tomb. Lycona suggests Matthew and the other two synoptics are likely the ones compressing the events that unfolded on Sunday morning, Matthew has likely compressed the events of the morning and simplified the account. And on the other hand, John reports less of the message from the angels. Matthew is compressed elsewhere when he narrates the centurion going to Jesus and petitioning him to heal his servant, rather than sending two separate sets of emissaries, while never seeing Jesus himself as in Luke. However, if the resurrection narratives in the synoptics have not been conflated and greatly compressed, why is the initial appearance of the angels to the women absent in John? If Matthew and the synoptics conflated and compressed elements in the narrative, of necessity, they would have needed to redact other elements in order to improve the flow of the narrative. As we have noted in previous videos, leaving out details another author mentions is not necessarily a contradiction. Each author likely highlighted the parts of the account they saw fit to construct their narrative flow. Matthew has probably compressed the events of the day, and John probably decided to explain what happened in more detail, but also decided to focus on other important instructions given by Jesus and the angels. Thus, when we study the Gospels in their cultural context, this contradiction is better understood and resolved.